If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Hikers, campers of deep woods and cryptid trails, what's the scariest experience you've had out there? I was mountain biking along a mountain road that connected two trails. I was passed by a pickup truck going the same direction as me. A few minutes later, the pickup passed me going in the opposite direction. I took notice but didn't think too much about it. When it passed me a third time, going in the same direction as me, my spidey senses started tingling. I'm a woman, and I was riding alone. The truck disappeared over a hill that I had just started climbing. When I got to the top of the hill, the truck was parked off the side of the road about 100 feet away, and the guy was out of his truck, standing in the middle of the road, looking in my direction. I turned around, bombed down the hill, and rode as fast as I could back to the single track where I knew a car couldn't follow. Scared the hell out of me. I remember when I was a kid driving down an old dirt road with my mom in the middle of the woods. When suddenly the car stopped abruptly. I remember looking at my mom, and she had a look of horror on her face as she was looking out the front windshield. Then I looked out and saw what she was looking at, and I have never been so scared in my life. There, sitting in the middle of the road, was a tiny little man, almost like a Keebler elf, straight from your worst nightmare, from the depths of hell. He was just standing there, hat in hand, staring at us for what seemed like an eternity. It seemed like my mom, myself, and this creepy little demon elf were all frozen in fear. Then all of a sudden this tiny little demon elf started to move. In fact, it started to hop, and it hopped away. It was a ducking rabbit. That's why when people say they've seen Bigfoot, a ghost, or anything of the sort, I give them the benefit of the doubt, because if my mom and I had turned around and left before the rabbit hopped away for the rest of our lives, we both would have been convinced we saw a tiny woodland elf. Either that, or creepy demon ELFs that live in the woods have the magic ability to turn into rabbits. I was solo hiking Mount Esther after summiting Whiteface a few years ago. The trail up Esther is a very densely sided, well-worn trail. You really can't walk off of it. I tried. Going up, I hear this motherly voice call out, "Ready or not, here I come." There were other people hiking that day, so I figured there was some family on the trail either ahead of or behind me. Shortly after hearing this, I passed some people who were on their way back down and mentioned it. None of them heard the voice, and none of them sounded like it. I figured the family had to be behind me. I got to the top, waited a few minutes, and hiked back down. There was no one. The only way this could have logically happened is if some family hiked miles of mountain trail, took the Esther offshoot, hiked part way up it, and played hide and seek on a twisting but very linear path, only to turn back 20 minutes from the summit. I went recently camping in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. It was black pitch night, and we had a campfire, and, of course, many glasses of wine. I was not intoxicated though because we also had a lot of food. Then, all of a sudden, my husband said, "I wonder where the guy with the horse is going." I heard someone but did not see them, but he said he saw someone on a horse. I told him no one was going to go horseback riding at midnight. 10 minutes later, we heard the person coming back from the back entrance to a national park. It is a very small entrance, not really a gate, you can only go by foot or, I guess, horse. He saw the horse and the person. I did not see anything. I am convinced we saw and heard a Civil War ghost. Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, was a battleground, and it is said to be haunted. I was parked up in a very rural car park in my camper van, all lights off, inside and obviously outside too, and about to get into bed. I realized I'd left my charger cable in the front, so I opened the curtains to reach into the front to get it. It's like pitch black, and we're 100% the only ones in the car park. I'm getting the cable, and then something catches my eye just on the edge of my peripheral vision. I look up, can't see anything, think it must be a reflection on the screen, and carry on trying to get the cable. Again, something moves, again, nothing is there when I look up. I don't like it, so now I'm half looking up while trying to find the cable. Then I see two tiny dots maybe 10 meters, 30 feet, away, they blink, move, then disappear. Cool, it's a fox or something. I get the cable, and I'm about to go into the back when I see it move again. This time it's maybe 4/5 m, 12/15 of a foot away, and this time it's higher up, about head height to me, and I'm standing up in a Sprinter van. This time around the eyes, I can see the faint reflection of a face, but with dark holes where the eyes and mouth should be, maybe the outline of something like a nightgown, and then it disappears again. I'm alone and a grown man, but I had the coldest shiver run right through me and totally shit myself. I grabbed the keys, double-checked that the doors were all locked, then scrambled over the seats into the front, started the van in about half a second, and just backed out and noped the absolute duck out of there. The worst thing is, in a van, there's no rear view mirror, and it was about half a mile back onto the road. I was getting cold shivers all the way back to the road and into the nearest town, about 15 minutes of driving through roads with forests all around me most of the way. I'm sure I imagined half of it after the event, and years later, it feels like the whole thing was exaggerated and bullshit. Maybe I imagined the whole thing, but duck me, I've never been so close to tears from fear in my life before or since. To this day, I make sure I've got my charger cable before I get in the back of the van. Something pretty scary happened up near U Lake a couple years ago. I went up on a Friday one weekend in late May with 3 friends. We had our tents pitched a couple hours before nightfall. We decided to go for a short hike close by. Nothing too long because we wanted to come back earlyish and smoke a bit of weed and hang out. When we got back to our tents, all the zippers were as wide open as possible. Nothing was missing, though. There were no signs of anyone around either. We were all pointing fingers at one another, laughed it off, and got out the food. I didn't think much of it. As night fell, my one friend noticed some movement about 60 to 80 yards behind my other friend and me. We all looked and saw 8 people standing on a foot-high elevated patch of soil or rock by the tree line. They were all standing in a line, looking our way. We couldn't make out faces or clothes. After about 2 minutes of no movement, they began walking into the trees and out of sight. They seemed to all recede into the brush in complete uniform. At this point, it was dark. Our initial reaction was confusion and a bit of nervousness. We ended up writing it off as a group of hikers stopping to look at whatever. I didn't feel like touching the weed after that. Nothing more occurred. I'm never going back to that lake, though. Gave me the creeps and still does. This didn't happen while camping or hiking, but it did happen in the Adirondacks. I've lived here my whole life. On Lake Street in Saranac Lake, there is a small shack near a boat launch. It's old, run down, and vaguely resembles a cottage. We think either someone lived in it a long time ago or it was used for the boat launch before the newer, bigger buildings were constructed. Anyway, when I was about 12 or 13, a friend of mine told me the cottage was haunted. Being a young 12 or 13-year-old, I just had to check it out. We get to the cottage, cameras ready, eager to see something paranormal, and after about an hour, we catch nothing. We decide to give up and head home. While departing, I quickly looked back at the creepy structure, and what I saw shook me. It was a gray hooded figure floating slowly before disappearing. Fast forward 10 years, I'm in my early 20s, and at this point, I've convinced myself that I imagine the hooded figure in the haunted cottage. I tell myself that I was young and eager to see a ghost, so I must have just made it up and eventually believed my own bullshit. That was until another friend of mine told me a similar story. He said he was walking his dog by the boat launch when he saw a gray hooded figure floating by. Hearing him perfectly describe a ghost I thought I imagined was one of the creepiest experiences of my life. It's the only paranormal experience I've ever had. I know a lot of people won't believe me, and honestly, I totally understand. But if you ever find yourself by the Lake Street boat launch, keep an eye out. Maybe you'll see it too. Growing up in the Appalachian Mountains. My friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We had decided to try and find a new place to set up camp, and we walked for what felt like a few miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us. We got the camp set up and the fire going, and the plan was to wait until nightfall, smoke some weed, and play Monopoly. Anyway, camp is set, the fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs wood. The sun is down, and we're both cutting up and having a good time. My friend is sitting on this little chair he always brought and loading up this makeshift bong, and I am crouched, breaking some excess limbs off some of the logs we had gathered for the fire. All of a sudden, this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I both stopped immediately and looked at each other. The breeze lasted just long enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness, neither of us said a word. Across from us, on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running and would slow to a walk and then run again. Definitely on 2 legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped with a softer crunch on the underbrush. I knew by the sound that it had taken a crouch. I was crouched still and knew I was staring right at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy," and when he did, I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel and hear it in him. I had been so fixated on the footsteps and rationalizing what I heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid. But this was true fear, It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend grab some leaves after a while, and he dropped them on the fire. For a split second, the leaves covered the fire, and we were in pure darkness. When the fire sprang to life, we both quickly grabbed more leaves and brush and threw them on the fire. I got some sticks and logs on there, and neither of us took our eyes off the spot or moved much for over an hour. Finally, the leaves crunched, and it slowly walked off. Whatever it was, it had sat crouched watching us without moving for far longer than any animal would. It wasn't until after the footsteps disappeared that I realized the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill. Spoiled eggs almost for the rest of the night. Besides whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped looking at the spot. Nobody went into the tent, and I had a very short, light sleep sitting on the ground with my head rested on my hands. My friend never went to sleep. In the morning, we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day, we talk about it. In the 7 to 8 years since it happened, my forester friend has been a real goofy guy, but he comes from a family of foresters and has always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants you come across. He had no fear of going camping by himself. Has not camped by himself out there since. I've spent my life in Georgia and love hiking all over, but I must admit that North Carolina has the best mountains. For this reason, I frequently drive up there to hike and camp. This time, I went up with my family in an RV and stayed with them in Maggie Valley. The next day, however, I had them drop me off about 10 miles away at the Cold Mountain trailhead, and I planned to hike up, spend the night, and be back down in the morning. I was by no means inexperienced at hiking or camping, but I had never camped alone. On top of that, I didn't bring a pistol, something I won't go without now. On the way up, the trail was surprisingly strenuous. Eventually, it began to get darker, and I realized I needed to stop and set up while I still had light, so I stopped about half a mile short of the summit and figured I would continue in the morning. Nothing eventful happened. I set up camp in a really good spot, ate my food, and went into the tent. At this point, I realized I hadn't run into a single other person my entire way up. This wasn't eerie at the time, but soon it would be. I have trouble sleeping and usually lay awake for up to an hour trying to sleep. During this, I thought I heard someone lightly walking around the general area because of the rhythm of the steps. I brushed it off as my mind running wild, but I did pull my big old knife out of my bag and put it next to me in the sleeping bag. That morning, I woke up and ate oatmeal. As I ate, I looked over at my tent and noticed a strange bundle of dried twigs and berries tied with green cord propped against it. Internally, I was pissed at myself, but I packed my crap up and took off within 5 minutes. And no way I bothered to go to the summit. I headed straight down. On the way down, I realized there was a pretty heavy fog, and I ended up on a side trail that eventually ended, and I was lost. I used a compass to eventually reorient myself and find the trail again, one of the biggest reliefs. I made it out without incident. However, I came to find out that the same morning, a 27-year-old died on the same section of trail as me, and it's possible I would have run into him had I not gotten lost and rejoined the trail later. His family seems to have scrubbed the internet of several of the articles on him. The scariest part was knowing that someone knew where I was and watched me, and I had no clue about them. So this happened last year in Virginia and is also the reason I never backpack alone anymore. I was taking summer courses at the time, so I thought it was a great time to go explore some of the Virginia wilderness. When I got close to the park area, I saw a little outdoor shop where people hiking the Appalachian Trail stopped. I went in to grab a map of the area, just in case I got lost. As I was talking to the owner, he mentioned a trail that's not well known but has a pretty cool waterfall and swimming hole. This piqued my interest, so I had him show me the map. It took me outside the state park, but he said it was a great place to go. I paid for the map and thanked the owner. I texted my roommate and parents about the new trail, and I parked my car and set off on my adventure. I was planning 3 days and 2 nights. I started on part of the Appalachian Trail. As I got further and further from the main trails, I saw fewer and fewer people. Around early afternoon, 3 miles from my destination, I noticed it was unnaturally silent, no birds, no bugs, not even wind, and I had a feeling of being watched. I shook it off as me overanalyzing the situation. I got to the waterfall, and it wasn't too spectacular, but it was cool to look at. I stripped down to my skivvies and took a dip. It was pretty refreshing. As I was getting my clothes back on, I started whistling to myself. It was chilling because it was stuck in my head. That's when I heard something whistle the same tune back. I thought it was a bird copying me, so I went back and forth with it, and it'd repeat whatever I whistled. I thought it was pretty neat. As I was setting up camp, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched again, like I'd get goosebumps and my hair would stand up. As night fell, I built a small fire and lit my jet boiler to make dinner. As I did this, I became hyper-aware that, again, there was no sound, just deafening silence. Some part of my brain was telling me that I wasn't safe and to leave. I ignored it and crawled into my tent with my flashlight and book. I went to sleep without incident. When I woke up the next morning, my site was trashed. My camp stool was nowhere to be found, my bear bag with my food was cut down, and the contents were thrown across the site. My first thought was that a crafty animal chewed through the rope and got at the bag, but I looked at the rope, and it was cut with something very sharp. Plus, none of the food was even touched. I also noticed bare footprints all around my campsite. Keep in mind that I'm at least 6 to 8 miles from a road. As I was looking at the mess, I heard a branch snap off in the distance, so I turned to look in that direction. I saw nothing, but I heard that whistling again, my whistle from yesterday, but it was different, it sounded more sinister. It made my hair stand on end, and this is when I listened to my instincts to get the hell out. It sounded like it was a little off in the distance, so I packed up my camp as fast as I could. The whistling got closer as I finished stuffing the tent into my bag. I didn't bother putting anything away properly. The whistling was incessant and sounded like it was coming from all directions. I got fed up with the whistling and stood, and I yelled into the woods, "Shut up and what the duck do you want?" It stopped whistling, and it was quiet for a moment, then it repeated what I said in my voice. It sounded just like me but was distorted, like it came from an old TV. After I heard this, I immediately threw my pack on and ran the direction I came. I heard it moving just behind me, quickly switching between the whistle and my voice. It felt like it was toying with me, not coming too close but not being too far. Eventually, it sounded like it got further and further away from me. Then it stopped suddenly. When it stopped, I stopped and turned around. I wished I hadn't because I heard the most bone-chilling screech ever coming from right next to me. That's when I started running again. I didn't look, I only ran. In less than a half mile, I ran into a couple who were also backpacking. They saw the look of terror in my face and asked if that was me who screamed and if I was okay. I told them about what happened, and they decided not to go down where I just came from. We moved to a more populated trail as quickly as we could. As soon as I got back in my car, I drove to one of the park's ranger stations and reported what happened. Since the site was off park grounds, they told me it wasn't in their jurisdiction, but they'd send a ranger to investigate. The ranger station's parking lot runs right up to the woods, and when I was getting into my Jeep, I heard the chilling billowing tune coming from the woods just in front of me. I've never driven so fast in my life. When I told my roommate why I was back after only one night, all he said was, "Bro, I'm never going camping with you." I was hiking with a buddy near Tupper Lake. We were sitting in a fire tower, watching the sunset, and had just said goodbye to a young couple. About 2 minutes after they leave the peak, a blood-curdling scream fills the air. Keep in mind, they walked for 2 minutes, we were 50 feet in the air, and the wind was blowing towards them at about 20 miles per hour. My buddy and I looked at each other, scared out of our minds, with no idea what to do. We came for the sunset, so we stayed for the sunset, figuring if it was our time to leave this earth, we would do so with the image of an ADK sunset fresh in our minds. After the sun sets, we start walking down the trail with sticks in hand, freaking out. We walk for about 5 minutes and figure that we are probably doing well and just scaring ourselves. The rest of the hike down is unnerving at best, the woods are never comfy at night past the range of your light. We get to the bottom, and my buddy says, "Yo, there is another car here." When we came, there was only one car, a red one with the dude in it. The other girl showed up separately. She was the one who screamed. Her car was still here. He was gone. Duck. We run to our car, hop in, and start driving home. At this point, we are seriously considering calling the cops. As we are driving, we are passed, and it's the red car. I swung the car around, followed him back to the lot, and drove past the lot as his interior cab lights turned on. It's just him. No girl. To this day, we have no idea what happened. What we do know is that we told the guy in passing that we were going to camp on Bridge Brooks Island, and the next night we did, and we swore we were being watched the entire night, with a big scare coming from our boat hitting rocks and sounding like a guy running up on us. Not exactly a trek, but I visited my native village once. Me and my cousin, who lives there, were walking back through a wooded area. It was pitch black, though it was only around 6:30 p.m., and the power was out. Well, we heard footsteps behind us, and in our torchlight, we saw a man walking in the distance who looked like our grandfather. Now, we had just left our grandfather back at his place and were walking to our cousin's place, so we were a bit surprised, particularly about him walking in the dark without a torch. So we slowed down a bit to allow him to catch up. The distance between us remained the same. We could see him walking, but he was not getting near us. I glanced at my friend, and we both took a few steps towards him. Still the same distance. We got spooked and started walking or jogging towards my cousin's house in the dark. Whenever we glanced behind us, the figure seemed to be at the same distance from us, walking steadily with his eyes on the ground. Well, we reached his home, looked out, and couldn't see anyone. The next day, we asked our grandfather if he was all right and narrated the incident. He said he had dozed off and dreamed about us walking through the woods. My grandpa encountered a wildman while ice skating as a child in rural Idaho. He was born in the last years of the 19th century and spent his entire life living in rural Idaho as a farmer and rancher. He had tons of old cowboy stories he would tell us grandkids. Most of them were funny, some were cautionary, but a few were downright creepy. When my grandpa was 6 years old, he, along with his older brother and a gang of kids from nearby farms, decided to go ice skating for the day. At that time, my great-grandpa was working as a ranch hand, and the family lived near Chesterfield, Idaho, now mostly a ghost town. It was a bright and sunny January day in 1902, and though the temperature was low, the sun kept things somewhat warm. They had hitched sleighs to their horses and headed down to the Portneuf River to ice skate. There were 8 kids altogether, and they were excited to show off their new skates from Christmas. Along with my grandpa and his brother, there were the 3 Robinson kids, Tommy Bayer, and the Gooch twins. The best spot to skate was next door to Gooch's ranch. The river there was broad and shallow, so the ice tended to be thicker, and if they did fall through, they would just get their legs wet. The kids had spent a couple hours skating when a loud scream came from a willow bush on the river bank opposite them. The kids could only watch as a giant man, covered head to toe in thick black fur, came lumbering out of the bushes. It was carrying a large tree branch and was screaming in rage at the kids. They fled towards the sleighs, trying to scramble up the river bank in their skates. My grandpa, being the youngest, was at the back of the rush. He couldn't get a good foothold because of the skates and fell back towards the ice. The giant was now crossing the river towards them, screaming and swinging his branch. My grandpa was sure this creature was going to eat him. As my grandpa tells it, Lady Luck smiled down on me that day by the river, because as the giant was midway across the river, the ice gave way. It only submerged its shins but was slowed considerably as it tried to get back on top of the ice. This gave my grandpa's brother enough time to jump down and cut the laces off my grandpa's skates. They left the skates and dashed up the river bank and jumped onto the sleigh. As they looked back, the giant man was cresting the river bank. To their relief, it didn't chase the sleighs. He just stood there, hollering at the kids and swinging his tree branch. The kids were able to make it back to the Gooch ranch, where they told John Gooch, the twins' grandfather, about their encounter. Word spread quickly in the tiny farming community, and soon a posse was formed to hunt down the beast. Where the kids had been skating, there were footprints almost 2 feet in length. My grandpa's skates were found near the tracks. They had both been bent in half like horseshoes. The tracks headed west into the nearby mountains. The posse followed them as far as they could, but deep snow prevented their travel any farther. The creature was never sighted in that area again. This story captivated the small community, and soon word traveled across the country about the Idaho wildman. In the summer of 2012, I took a job as an expedition canoe guide on the boundary waters in northern Minnesota and Quetico, southern Ontario. These are massive wilderness areas of lakes and land. I was working for the Boy Scouts, and we were based on Moose Lake on the US side. My job was to facilitate a fun and safe multi-day trip, anywhere from 7 to 12 days out. Most of that summer was typical, but one expedition in particular still haunts me as a result of what happened to us over the course of a few days. Here is the account in full. My crew was on the younger side. There were 9 of us total, the maximum allowed in a group per our permit. There were 6 scouts, 2 adult advisors, scoutmasters, and myself. So I decided to take them to a waterfall called Eddy Falls. It's pretty flat up there, so a waterfall is somewhat rare, but that decision would end up putting us in the path of something. We visited the falls and camped near them. That evening, I had the boys working on camp setup while the advisors worked on the fire for dinner. I was collecting firewood in a big tangle of downed trees, brush, and bramble. I could faintly hear the falls off to my left when, out of nowhere, I heard the most unearthly scream or roar I've ever heard. It stopped me dead in my tracks, and I was frozen. The second scream was closer, and the third was closer. I couldn't see anything due to the thickness of the brush, but whatever this was, it was coming directly at me. By the fourth scream, I could feel it in my chest. I got nauseous and involuntarily barked at it. I've never before or since heard that sound come out of my body. The fifth scream almost physically hurt, but it snapped me back to reality, and I ran back to camp. My crew had heard it too, but what am I to tell them? I claimed it was a boar. There's no boar up there, and the advisors knew I was lying but didn't call my bluff. After dinner, they went to their tents, and I retired to my hammock about 50 yards from camp. It must have been around 3 or 4 a.m. when I was awakened by what sounded to me like a woman sobbing. Not an outright cry, but a sob. At the same time, I'm hearing something walking through the thick brush down past my feet. So I listen, totally still and quiet, as it crosses into camp. I could hear the change from brush to granite rock, but I could still hear its heavy footfalls as it walked right through camp. And on towards me. At this point, the tarp is over my head, so I can't see a thing, and I don't know what to do. In no time, it was standing right next to me. I could hear the breathing, which was loud and congested sounding. I could smell the musk. I could feel its enormous presence only inches from my body. Just standing there. It's time to make a decision. I suddenly threw the tarp off my head, and as I did this, my left hand touched this thing in the chest. It was dark, but I could briefly make out a very large upright figure. The hair on it was long and coarse. It all happened in a second, and as soon as my hand made contact, it bolted back into the brush with immense speed for such thick debris. By the time I got my headlamp on, it was gone. My crew had slept through it all, so I read until the sun came up and decided not to mention it. The next day, we moved on a few miles towards base camp and camped on a small island. We were just arriving, and it was evening. One of the adult advisors needed to visit the grumper, so he walked towards it. About 2 minutes later, we heard him yelling, and he came running back to camp, still pulling his pants up, and said that he'd just seen a gorilla run right in front of him. I asked if maybe it was a bear, and he said absolutely not, that he'd hunted bears for years, and it was not a bear. It was a monkey, and it was about 9 feet tall. At this height estimate, I'm imagining being back in my hammock. If I touched the chest and I was about 6 feet off the ground, that would put the head close to 9 feet up. Was it stalking us? Was there more than one? The boys are now scared. It's time to mitigate. I suggest a night paddle. No one's sleeping anymore anyway, so we packed back up and set out at around 8 p.m. and paddled by headlamp for several miles. My plan was to get back onto Moose Lake and camp very near the base so we could be the first crew off the water the following day. Moose Lake is connected to Newfound Lake by a small pinch and a channel of water that's not very deep or wide. There are dark woods on both sides. We were right in the middle of the pinch when a rock the size of a basketball came flying out of the woods on the right side and narrowly missed the bow of the canoe I was steering. There's no cliff there. This thing was forcefully thrown at us from the tree line. At this point, we paddled like hell. We paddled to the center of Moose Lake, tied all 3 canoes together, and sat out there all night. With the sunrise, we paddled to base camp and ended our expedition. They did not want to talk about what happened, and I was okay with that. They left for Oklahoma the next day. After they left, I went to work a shift in the canoe yard, helping crews offload. My buddy Justin got back that day from a trip in the same area we had been in, Bear Loop, and as I was helping him put a boat on the rack, I noticed he had a distant look, almost 1,000-yard stare. I asked how his trip went, and he said it was all good until they hit Knife Lake or Newfound Lake. He said they were messed with for 2 nights on Knife and then had a rock thrown at them in the Newfound pinch. Sure enough, for a solid 2 weeks after that, crews kept coming back from that area with very similar stories. One night there was a crowd of us guides in the staff lodge swapping trail stories, and these encounters came up one after another. Screams, rocks, and sightings of apes. Then, from the back corner of the room, I hear a chuckle. It's one of the old veteran guides who's been there for over a decade. All he said was, "It's about time somebody else saw one." I asked how long he'd known they were there. He said he's been encountering them for 10 years. He said, "They talk to me." This shocked me. Like a language? I asked. No, they communicate telepathically. The less you acknowledge them, the less they'll bother you, but they can read you, and they like it when you're afraid. It's like a game to them. What happened out there is still a big question in my mind. I've always been open to the idea of Sasquatch. Their existence was never a huge stretch for me. But what really sticks with me is the way that the veteran guide spoke of their intelligence and parapsychological abilities. That they can read human emotion as clearly as pages in a book. That they know our species better than we know ourselves. I'm a former longtime airborne ranger, having served for many years in 275 in Washington state. After my service, I was a Forest Service firefighter and disaster response contractor. Suffice to say, I am a very experienced outdoorsman, professionally trained. In 2009, I was hiking in the Weyerhaeuser Forest Reserve near Offutt Lake in western Washington state. The preserve was adjacent to the home of a buddy's father, and before setting off into the lumber preserve, his father had implored me not to go hiking in there alone, as it was a very dangerous area, a very frightening area. He had lived there for 30 years and refused to let his kids ever step foot into the forest. Being a young, confident ranger, I laughed off his superstition and headed out into the virgin forest. It was an unusually hot and humid day in late spring, and I was armed with a Glock 19 9mm pistol and feeling very capable and competent. I had made it about 3 miles into the forest and came to a massive bowl section of perfectly manicured pine forest with no undergrowth, just a tan spruce pine needle bed as far as the eye could see. It looked like I was stepping down into a forest bowl the size of a modern football stadium. I got about halfway down the bowl, and literally every sound in the forest became totally deafeningly silent. All in an instant. It was as though I had stepped into a soundproof studio room in one step. No bugs, no wind, no ambient sound, nothing. By this time, I had been to combat twice, graduated ranger school, and was a pretty salty individual, but I am not ashamed to admit I was overcome with a feeling of fear, dread, and deep guttural paralyzing fear. I gathered myself together, turned around, and practically ran the entire way back to Curtis' father's house. I got in my truck, left, and never went back. I've spent years thinking about what happened in those woods and, to this day, have no answers. I was completely sober, fully aware of my surroundings, and in good spirits and health at the time of this incident, with no mental, physical, or psychological issues. I cannot say what the incident was caused by, but I have never been so deeply in fear in my life. Even thinking about it now, over a decade later, makes me feel uneasy, as though whatever was in that forest is still there. This story is, unfortunately, true. I grew up in the Sierra Nevadas. I wasn't big on camping, but spent a good chunk of my childhood weekends hiking with family and friends. The summer that I was 16 about 10 years ago, now, my cousin, Candace, had come back from her first year of college, and her boyfriend, Jason, was visiting. Jason wanted to go on a hike with lake views, and cousin and I knew just the one. It was one of our favorites. The three of us set off on this hike. It is an in and out trail that takes about 2 to 3 hours to the top, 2 to 3 hours back down. There are some smaller trails that branch off. We make it to the top in good time and enjoy our lunches overlooking the lake. After about an hour, we hear a scream in the distance. Specifically, a mountain lion scream. If you've never heard a mountain lion scream, it's really unnerving. It sounds a bit like a very loud, terrified woman screaming. This is not good, because when a mountain lion screams, it's part of a mating ritual. That means there are multiple mountain lions, and close. The bears in the Sierras are softies, but the mountain lions will attack you. They'll attack your pets. They've even been known to attack bikers. Jason was really freaked out. Cousin and I were wary, but it wasn't the first time we had heard of mountain lions, and we had both seen them before. There was also an incident where, as kids, we laid out some expensive steak in my backyard in the hopes of luring a mountain lion to take pictures of it. It did not work, and my mother was unhappy about the steaks. We tell Jason that we need to pack it up and get back down the mountain. About 40 minutes into the hike back, he realized that he forgot his phone at the lookout and has rushed to leave. Of course. We decided that Candace and Jason would hike back up to retrieve his phone, and I would stay there, on the trail, to warn any other potential hikers that there are lions in the area. This is obviously not ideal for any of us, but it seemed like the best choice at the time. I found a nice rock to sit on by the trail and was going through the pictures we took. They had been gone for around 50 minutes when I heard the scream again. And it's hard to tell, but I think it's closer than before. I start to freak out because being alone is not good if the lion is nearby. About 20 minutes after that, I hear the scream again, and there is now no doubt that it's closer. Logically, I know that lions don't scream when hunting, they are quiet. If a lion was hunting me, I wouldn't know it. That knowledge did not make me less scared. A couple minutes after that, I hear it again, extremely close by. I'm looking around and trying to find the best place for me to stand, back covered, in case the worst happens. Suddenly, I see something out of the corner of my eye. Standing still 20 feet down the trail, a couple feet off of it, is a man. He's completely naked. He's skinny. And he's just standing there, looking at me. If you don't know where you're going, it's easy to get lost in the woods around there. And it doesn't take long for being alone, lacking food and water, in the wilderness to make people a little disoriented. A little crazy. My immediate response is that this man is probably a lost hiker, and judging by how dirty he was, he'd been lost a long time. He needs help. I started walking towards him, asking if he was okay. I suddenly get this feeling of wrongness. I don't know how else to describe it, but the hair stood up on my neck. I stopped in my tracks, maybe 15 feet away now, and had the overwhelming urge to run. It seemed wrong, he looked wrong in a way I can't quite articulate. Instead of wanting to help, I'm now scared. I ask again if he's okay. He looks at me, then opens his mouth wide and screams. Not a normal scream. He screamed so loudly. Worse, it sounded just like the mountain lion. It occurred to me that we were probably hearing him the whole time. It was the single most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. I started screaming too. Why was he just standing there screaming? Do I run? Do I get out the bear mace? Suddenly, he closed his mouth, turned around, and ran into the woods very quickly. He disappeared into the trees, but the feeling of wrongness was still with me. I considered bolting down the trail but decided to wait for my cousin and her boyfriend, who luckily arrived within 10 or 15 minutes. I told them what happened, and we decided to call the rangers when we got service. I've always been left with this unsettling question. Did I see a mentally ill, lost hiker who really needed my help? Or did I see something else, something not human, mimicking the call of a mountain lion and stalking us down the mountain? Back in 2021, my family took a trip to Lake St. Etla in North Carolina. A beautiful lake that's rich in Native American history and surrounded by mountain trails. We decided to go on one of these trails on an overcast day. I am not an athletic person and suffer from asthma, so I was behind the rest of my family by myself. About halfway through the hike, I heard my sister yell my birth name, but it sounded like it was off the trail. She never calls me by my real name, just my nickname, which I've had since I was a baby. It sounded like she was scared, so I was very tempted to run off and find her, but I knew my sister wasn't stupid. She wouldn't go off the trail, even in an emergency. I quickly caught up to the rest of my family, and my sister was there with them. Resting on some rocks next to a waterfall. Chatting away and taking pictures. I asked my sister if she had called my name. She didn't know what I was talking about. She had been talking to our dad the whole time. I don't know what called my name that day, but I'm glad I didn't listen to it. Who knows what would have happened to me. I haven't been to that trail since this encounter. I don't have a clue who called my name. If you're educated on Appalachian folklore, please give me some insight on what happened to me. I live with my husband and 2 teens in a cul-de-sac that borders a wooded area. We all love spending time in our yard and enjoying nature. On 2 occasions now, my kids have told me about some eerie experiences they've had. My kids recently got a trampoline and love to be on it, even at night. Recently, they heard whistling and conversations in the woods around 10 p.m. Now I can assure you that nobody goes down there, on the wooded embankment too, except in hunting season. This really freaked them out, and they came in and told me right away. I should mention that we have a cat that escapes sometimes, and we end up in the yard looking for her and calling her name. Another time, my son was out around dusk looking for the cat near the border of the woods. He was by himself, and his sister was inside. He said he heard his sister calling his name from the woods twice and then giggling. This was very unsettling, to say the least. I lived in Columbia, South Carolina, and frequented CNP, so I'm familiar with the area. I would often jump the fence and walk the boardwalk at night, as it's super peaceful to walk the swamp and hear all the wildlife. They never have a ranger or guard there after hours, so I was always alone. The last time I did this in October 21st, I was taking my usual stroll with a flashlight in hand. I should mention that between the insects and frogs, the sound is loud. But then it completely stopped when I was about a mile in. I heard what I thought was my wife calling me from the trail ahead, but she wasn't there. I was alone and she was out of town. I then heard water sloshing to my right and saw nothing with my flashlight. I chalked it up to being tired and kept moving. The wildlife started up shortly after, and everything was fine. Maybe 15 minutes later, I noticed it got eerily quiet again and heard swamp water sloshing on my left, but this time it was more deliberate. Like somebody walking. I was in a thick portion of the cypress and couldn't see more than 20 feet in front of me, and then I heard my wife's voice again. Again, she wasn't with me and was out of town. She certainly wasn't moving through a swamp. At 1 a.m. I saw what looked like a human silhouette move between the trees for a split second, but it was off. Very skinny, pale, and taller than me at 6 feet. I noped the duck out of there and ran the almost 2 miles back to my truck, and I didn't slow down until I heard the wildlife again. Like I said, this is a boardwalk that's in a swamp in the boonies. Nobody is walking around in the water at night without a light, or ever, and I don't know of any animal that big that walks in a bipedal pattern. I have spent my life in the outdoors. I feel I should add that I wasn't high or sleep deprived, I just like the woods at night. I was so freaked out. I'm convinced I encountered a crawler, Wendigo, or something else that can mimic voices. There's no way some meth head was stumbling through the swamp miles from civilization. That sounds like wifey, but then again, it is also South Carolina. I live in Georgia, the state, in a rural town not too far from a major city. There's a set of woods behind our house. Strange occurrences have always surrounded these woods. One night, I was taking our dog out. He stays in the back half of the house due to not liking the other dogs. I took him out the side door and walked around the house to the fence. For some reason, when we left the house, he was absolutely terrified. He didn't want to go out, which is very unusual for a dog who's quick to snatch someone's soul if prompted. Not thinking about it, we pushed onward. After he tinkled, we walked back. This is when I noticed it, or rather, heard it. Crunching of leaves. At first, I thought it was one of our dozen cats on the property, until I realized it was matching my steps. If I walked, you could hear me walking. If I stopped, it stopped. There's a small clearing between the woods where one of the sheds is. That's when we saw it. My dog was the first to see something, and then I saw some. I dunno. Creature? It was taller than the shed, so maybe a good 8 feet tall, and it darted across the clearing at a crazy fast speed. My dog, who again isn't scared of anything, bolted so fast that I dropped his leash, and he ran to the door whining. I was quickly behind him. Once we were inside, I quickly bolted the door and ran to tell my girlfriend what happened. She immediately wanted to investigate, saying it was probably a woodland creature. Armed with 2 flashlights, we went out the front door. As we walked towards the wood line, we could hear something moving around. It sounded like it was maybe 200 yards away. As we scanned with our flashlights, we saw nothing but kept hearing it. Then we heard it get closer and closer until it was maybe 20 feet away. Still nothing. No eyes, not even an animal call. Just rustling. My girlfriend is now scared for the house. I decided to check with the neighbors to see if maybe one of their many dogs got out. When I arrived at his house, my neighbor, whom we'll call Dave, explained that all his dogs were accounted for. Curious, he came to investigate. This is when I noticed that whatever this thing was had followed me along the wood line to Dave's house and was now behind Dave's house. Gun in hand, we went into his backyard, scanning for something. We could hear it rustling or maybe running. About 100 yards away in thick swampy woods. Way too thick for a person to walk in, let alone run in. Then it stopped. It was dead silent. Scanning and on edge, we hear and see nothing, and then bam, all of a sudden, it was 5 feet in front of us sprinting at me. It slammed the fence so hard that it rocked back and forth. Dave, scared shitless, shot randomly at, well, nothing. We never saw it. Never let it get close to us. Again, as I mentioned, the woods are thick. Too thick to run in, so what the duck teleported silently in front of us and slammed the gate. We were about to run. Then we heard it. It was human in nature, but not English. It sounded alien-like? Not a known language. Dave, a hunter for the last 40 years, still, to this day, can't explain what that was. Anyway, after we heard that, we bolted. He covered me, and I ran to my house. Not 10 minutes later, we both heard a loud explosion coming from the woods. It shook our houses and flickered our power. I ran outside to see what it was, and of course it was nothing, but when Dave came out and confirmed he felt the same thing, we were both once again terrified. Moments later, a few strangers from the neighborhood came driving down to our cul-de-sac, and they all agreed that the blast sound they heard came from behind our house. 911 was called, and the 2 police officers interviewed us separately. Our stories match. The responding officers refused to go anywhere near those woods. They took the report and left. To this day, we're still not sure what that encounter was. Also, Dave doesn't go outside at night anymore. It spooked him that bad. A couple years ago, me, my girlfriend, and her family decided to go out and explore an old church in the woods in rural Georgia. Our friends and we had planned that they would prank her family by hiding in the woods and playing drums and chanting. We had explored the area for about 20 minutes or so when we decided to sit on the front steps of the church to take a break. There's a dim street lamp lighting us up. The tree line was about 10 feet away, and there was zero visibility beyond it. We suddenly heard this sound. I've never heard anything like it. It had this bleating quality of a goat but was much deeper and more urgent, like a drawn-out scream. It was literally right at the tree line. My girlfriend and I immediately believed this was our friends who'd decided to go a different route with the prank, so we started playing it up. After a few minutes, it started to get old, and we told our friends to come out. No one came out. We figured they were just trying to keep the prank going for a bit longer than necessary, and we brushed it off, thinking they'd come out when they grew tired. We got up to go down to the old baptismal font a little further in the other direction, down the hill into the woods. We were on our way there when we began to hear drums and chants from down the hill. Our friends had been down at the font the entire time. Unless they'd invited someone else to prank us that we never saw and that they never told us about to this day, that noise came from someone or something else. When I got home that night, I stayed up for hours researching every animal sound in North Georgia, even branching out to the entire southeastern US in desperation to make sense of it. It's the scariest, unexplainable thing I've ever experienced, and I can still hear that sound in my head as clear as day. I don't think I'll ever forget it. In 1987, when I was 10 years old, we moved into a new house and a new neighborhood. My future best friend, I'll call him Andrew, invited me up to spend the night on a Friday after school. It was about the 1st of December or so, and a light snow had fallen. Well, this other kid we were friends with who lived on the same street as me was there as well. We played Nintendo and shot basketball for a while, then we started getting bored. Andrew asked me if I wanted to go to the pit. I said, "What's that?" He said, "Follow me." So we walked up through his backyard, and there was this huge abandoned rock quarry, and where we stood, it dropped about 50 down to this plateau area. There was also a cave that was covered up by large boulders and stuff right under our feet. When you climb down there to the plateau, there is another drop off about 80 feet to the very bottom, but you have to access it from another street. Well, we climbed down into the plateau area and were just looking around, and all of a sudden we saw this thing. All we've known to ever call it as a creature? It was scaling the rock wall we were just standing on, only about 150 feet to our left. It looked like it would have stood around 4 to 5 feet tall, and it was covered in white fur, so the snow camouflaged it. In the summer and hotter months, its coat was a brownish color. It climbed that wall like a man would. It turned to look at us, and we all bolted back up the cliffs to Andrew's house and never looked back. I had nightmares for about 2 weeks straight after that. This thing would mutilate cats, dogs, opossums, and hell, I've even seen deer that unfortunately got so close to the area that it was taken down. It almost got a few of us when we were kids too. What was weird was how it would kill. It would rip everything's spinal cords out of its body and eat all the organs. It was around for several years, and then it just vanished, and SHT just stopped. Craziest or scariest thing I've ever encountered in my entire life. I've searched and searched for what this thing may have been. I've gotten more into crypto in the last little bit, but I can't find anything similar to it other than a dog man, but I don't think it was tall enough to be a dog man. And it ran on all fours. Where I live, we have had relatively few COVID cases. There were almost none at all back in the fall. Because of that, although we were still living under certain restrictions, we had more public health sanctioned freedoms than many other places. My family and our fellow bubble family decided to take advantage of this by going on a fall getaway. We rented 2 side-by-side cabins in a beautiful, waterfront wooded area and had a lovely, relaxing weekend. On our final night there, my son decided to sleep in the other cabin with his bubble siblings around 11 p.m. He called over, asking for some forgotten thing. It was a very dark night, and there were certainly no streetlights in the deeply wooded cabin area, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked the short distance to the neighboring cabin to deliver whatever it was that he needed. On the walk back, I heard a whistle. It was a very human-sounding whistle, exactly the kind of whistle one makes to call in a dog. It sounded very close, but shining my light around, I saw nobody. I heard it again and assumed someone was whistling for the dog we'd heard earlier, so I didn't think much of it. A short time later, another call came from next door. My son couldn't settle and wanted to come back to our cabin. This time my husband and I both walked over, collected our child and his stuff, said goodnight to our bubble family, and walked back. We heard the same whistle again several times. It seemed to be on the dirt road ahead of us, moving gradually away. My husband commented that the dog must have gotten loose and the owner was out looking for it. Inside our cabin, we continued to hear the whistling, which came at irregular intervals of maybe 2 to 4 minutes. At first it would be loud and seem quite nearby, then it would gradually grow fainter, then stop as though the whistler had moved out of earshot. Then it would seem to circle around, coming from the other direction, getting louder as it moved past our cabin, then fading again into the distance. Then it would start all over again. Still not thinking much of it, my husband climbed into the loft to go to sleep while I started to pack for the trip home the next day. Our son was sleeping in a little room on the main floor to the left of the front door, and the small window in his room was cracked open to let in the unseasonably warm night air. I was standing by that window, quietly gathering his scattered things, while the whistle once again drew closer, but this time, instead of fading as it passed by, the next one was very close and incredibly loud, as though the whistler was just outside my son's window. The blind was down, but I was sure someone was on the porch right outside. I leapt to the front door, flung it open, and threw on the porch light, ready to tell off some prankster on our doorstep. Nobody was there. I grabbed my flashlight and took a few steps out past the circle of light, then thought better of it and retreated inside. I locked up the cabin. Deciding that I did not want to leave my sleeping son downstairs by himself, I settled on the sofa with a book. The whistles continued. Between each one, I would convince myself it was just a bird or an animal, only to hear it again and be certain that it could only be a human sound. Around 1:30 a.m., my husband suddenly got up and started to get dressed. I asked him what he was doing. "I'm going out to find whoever that is and ask them why they've been whistling for hours," he said. I was horrified. My husband is a pretty big guy, and I was as curious as he was, but I also felt deep in my bones that it would not be safe for him to go outside that night. I insisted that he go back to bed, and thankfully he did. I sat vigil, listening to the intermittent whistles, for at least another hour until I finally dozed off on the sofa. When I awoke, it was morning, the sun was peeking around the blinds, and the whistling had stopped. I cautiously peered outside, half expecting to see some sort of evidence of a nighttime intruder, but there was none. A little while later, we wandered next door, coffee mugs in hand, to get our friend's take on the mystery whistler. Amazingly, they had not heard a thing, despite the fact that the sound was so clearly audible in our cabin and would have passed right by them. We couldn't understand how they had not heard it. At checkout, I asked the woman at the kiosk down the road about it, but she just looked at me strangely and said she didn't know what it could have been. When I got home, I searched for audios of bird calls common to the area and then ones not common to the area, in the hope of finding that same whistle. Nothing I found was even close, and we still don't know what we heard that night, circling for hours and stopping just outside our cabin door. Camping with my family at a provincial park in Newfoundland, Canada, in the mid-1980s in Newfoundland, there is a lot of traditional folklore about fairies and being fairy-led, i.e., being sort of mesmerized and stolen away by the fairies, and although I've never really believed in that stuff, whenever I hear those tales, I can't help but think about this experience. We arrived at the campground around mid-afternoon. I remember that it was strangely empty. We saw no other occupied sites as we drove around, looking for the perfect spot. We picked our site, and as my parents were setting up, my older sister asked if she and I could go check out the little beach area, which was a shortish walk along a clearly marked downhill path through some birch woods. Our mom said yes but told us to be back in 2 hours. We found the sign pointing us to the beach trail and headed down the path. Almost as soon as we were out of sight of the campground, things started to feel off. It was weirdly quiet, with a sort of muffled feeling, no birds calling, no breeze, just a thick, velvety silence. I also noticed that there were strange-looking ferns growing thickly along the path all around us. Ferns are not an unusual sight in the Newfoundland woods, but these were different from the ones I'd seen before, bright, almost luminous green, and very, very large. Some were as tall as I was. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were people or animals hiding in them, watching us pass by. Although it had been a lovely, clear day, the weather started to change as we walked. A low-lying fog rolled in as we descended. Even living in Newfoundland, I'd never walked into a fog like that before, and it did nothing to relieve the eerie feeling that I was trying to ignore. Finally, we arrived at a steep set of wooden stairs, and following them, we emerged onto a small, foggy beach. With the woods behind and above us, it felt very closed in, and I started wishing that we were safely back with our parents at our campsite. My sister made a small noise beside me, and I turned to see what had caught her attention. Although I'd thought we were alone, I now noticed that there was a man several meters away, standing very still and gazing silently out over the water. My sister called out a friendly hello. It was Newfoundland in the 80s, people did that sort of thing, but he didn't move or appear to hear her. After a minute or two, I started to feel nervous, so I talked my sister into heading back to our campsite. This is where things get a bit fuzzy. I don't remember leaving the beach, but the next thing I knew, we were on a wide, unfamiliar dirt road. It seemed like no time had passed, but I was tired, and my legs and feet felt like I'd been walking for a long time. The sun was also pretty low in the sky, which was strange because I thought we'd been gone for less than an hour. I felt disoriented and had no idea where we were, and I started to panic a bit, thinking we were lost. My sister immediately went into protective older sibling mode, saying not to worry because she was pretty sure she knew the way back. We headed off down the road in the direction she suggested and walked for about 45 minutes or so until we finally emerged at the campground, not far from our campsite. It was now almost completely dark, and we ran to our trailer to find our dad there, worriedly asking where we had been. Although we thought we'd been gone for less than 2 hours, my dad said we'd been gone for more than 5. He said that our mom had headed to the beach to look for us while he'd stayed to wait for us at the campsite. By now, full-on darkness was setting in, and our dad was worried that our mom had not returned with us. As he prepared to go out looking for her, she burst in the door, frantically saying that she'd run up and down the trail multiple times and still hadn't found us. She was amazed when she saw us. The only way to access that beach, aside from cutting through steep, thick woods, was to take that trail, and we had not passed her. Once we'd all calmed down, we ate dinner and headed to bed. As I lay in my bunk, I remember hearing my mom quietly tell my dad how creepy and strange the trail had felt. Although we'd planned to stay longer, we packed up and left quickly the following morning and never returned to that campground. My friends and I decided to hike Upper Yosemite Falls. I really had no idea how treacherous that trail was, and our preparation was minimal. We started off a little late, after breakfast. We have a great time first few miles, but eventually the group got split based on speed and interest. My guy friend and I were left behind, and I insisted on stopping and enjoying the view quite often. Eventually, we made it to the top around 4:30 p.m. and the trail was very crowded. Then I insisted on laying on the rock and resting. All said and done, when we started our return journey around 5:36 p.m. and we had to cover 17 miles. After a few miles, I realized that there was no one on the trail now except the two of us. No phone, no way to contact anyone, sun was setting quick, but luckily we had one flashlight. My friend was joking and he shushed me and said, "Do you hear that?" That freaked me out. As it got dark, we still had 6 miles to go, and I have never been so scared in my life. Being among those woods was nerve-wracking. The last 2 miles were through deep woods and I started seeing forms in those tree trucks and I started to cry. My friend kept it together and told me we will make it and it will be alright. Eventually, we got to the bottom around 9 p.m. and seeing those camp lights far away brought me to my knees. I was kissing the ground and thanking everything in this world for this thing called civilization. We had a group of families that would meet annually to canoe, hike, and camp near the Tellico River. I was about 9 years old the night we ended up on Rattlesnake Ridge. To be fair, it was a local name not on the map. Our 4 families had been looking for a camp with a view, and this spot looked out over a long, green, soft smoky mountain valley. We pitched camp with tents, Coleman stoves, and coolers, set up a fire pit in the middle, and stacked up wood. Just before dusk, the park ranger pulled up. He asked the group of us, dinner plates in hand, if we planned to actually stay the night right here on Rattlesnake Ridge, and most of us laughed, but he looked really serious when he said it was probably not a good idea. "Lots of bites out here," he said, shaking his head. "The hospital is really far away. I hate to go through that again." One or the other adult reassured him we would be fine, and he left shaking his head. A nervous laughter, our bellies full, the guitars and singing ensued, and the sun fell. Finally, after some time, someone said, "There are no snakes up here." At the exact moment, a 5-foot snake, of undetermined species, slithered between 2 of us and directly into the campfire we were sitting around. It flipped around for a second, sending embers into the sky like life itself escaping its twisted body. I have never seen 14 people get into their tent so efficiently. Pro tip: do not spend the night anywhere named Rattlesnake Ridge. A group of friends and I rented a place on a lake for just a fun-filled, drunken weekend. We were all in our early to mid-20s. So 9 p.m. rolls around, and about 8 of us are inside the house and 5 are outside. The house was a 2-story house with a 2nd-story deck or back porch, and it was surrounded by the woods. Down through the woods, you would then hit the lake. I'll mention that we had already experienced some weird vibes from the locals when we first arrived in town, mostly just backcountry old-timers that I assumed were leering and irritated because we were a bunch of college-aged kids looking to have a good time. But the town and the lake were large, so it's not like anyone knew where we were staying. My friend and I were just getting lost in conversation, and all of a sudden there was this weird feeling that encompassed us. Like an unnerving physical experience that came from the woods behind us. It was so strong that we both kind of quieted down, and then out of nowhere, this loud chanting abruptly came from the woods. I have no idea how far away it was because of the way the lake is set up, but I'm pretty sure the voices carried up through the forest. It sounded like a cult chanting away, and all of the voices were male. I mean, they were loud and perfectly in sync. I think we were frozen for all of about 20 seconds before I couldn't contain myself and darted towards the house with her following me. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came with that chanting, but it was almost evil. Like something so powerfully uninviting. I was shaking by the time we got up to the 2nd story and ran out on the balcony with the other 3 friends. One of them is my brother. By the time we got up there, the chanting was gone, and I naturally asked, "Did you guys hear that?" In the most shaky, freaked out voice. They had all heard it, and not even seconds later, the chanting began again. So the 5 of us are out there peering into the forest, listening to this chanting that would sometimes sound far away and then sound relatively close. All male voices in the weirdest language, or I don't even know what it was. It sounded like a strange, extreme church. Then, following the chanting, a loud bang like someone hitting a huge metal object sounded, and then the worst part came. A man wailing, like in extreme pain, all of my hair was up. It was the freakiest experience ever. My brother and I were staring at each other in a mixture of scared excitement and horror. The wailing stopped, and then it was back to the chanting, which eventually died out. I was so freaked out by it that I wanted to call the cops because whoever screamed had been in a lot of pain. That, mixed with the weird chanting, just made me immediately think of some terrible sacrifice going on. One friend tried to say it had to be some drunk guys just messing around singing and being weird, but no way was that coming from some drunk guys. They were perfectly in sync until the bang and then the wail of pain. And then all that weird tension and energy was just gone. Nope. I didn't call the cops, and I wish I would've, but honestly, the forest was so large, and since the lake house was up looking down at the woods and lake, it could have been anywhere. It definitely wasn't in our close proximity, but it was close enough to hear all of that perfectly. We went in and got some of the others, but by the time they came out, the chanting had stopped. Someone wanted to go explore and find where it had been coming from, but obviously that was a stupid idea. After that, I was so ready to go home that I can't explain the relief of driving away from there the next morning. Even now, it gives me the worst feeling. Whatever that was, it felt so wrong and evil. I'll never forget that moment. I can only imagine it was some weird cult stuff.